Hi, it's Blake from FishBait. In this video, we will talk about what Laserfiche Audit Trail is, the different editions of Audit Trail, how to configure Audit Trail itself, as well as how to configure Audit Trail to work with the Laserfiche repository and Laserfiche Forms. Let's get started. So the first question is, what is Laserfiche Audit Trail? Audit Trail allows you to track different activities that are performed in the Laserfiche repository, such as editing metadata, editing a document, adding, removing pages to a document, deleting files, adding files, any of those types of things. Starting with Laserfiche Audit Trail version 11, you can also audit certain activities within Laserfiche Forms. And depending on the version of Laserfiche Forms that you have will also depend on what you're able to track within Laserfiche Forms itself for Audit Trail. So the next question is, how does Audit Trail work? Laserfiche Audit Trail first has to be configured, and there's different places where this configuration takes place. The first is within the Laserfiche Audit Trail software itself, where we will configure it to connect to a repository's Audit Trail log files and pull that information in, as well as Laserfiche Forms. The other is within the Laserfiche repository, and as well Laserfiche Forms. In the repository, you are able to configure different groups or users, as well as events for those users and groups that will be audited and recorded into a log file. The log files are actually created by the Laserfiche server for the repository, and they are stored in a binary log file. The form server will actually send the information to Audit Trail, and Audit Trail will save the content to the audit log files. So they behave slightly differently, but the concept is still the same. The ability to audit different items within the repository depends on what version, or I should say edition, of Audit Trail that you have. I have the Laserfiche Audit Trail help file pulled up, and you can see here that it describes the different events that can be recorded based on which edition of Audit Trail that you are using. You can also see the different types of events that are available for you to audit for the repository. One thing you'll notice is that in the starter edition, for the ones that have an icon there, that will only record successful events. So if there is an unsuccessful attempt to do one of those events, it will not record the unsuccessful events. You will need either the standard edition or the advanced edition. As far as what's different between standard edition and advanced edition, essentially there are a few different items. Like here you can see delete classification level, modify classification level, set repository options, those types of events that are available to you. The main one, though, is the ability for end users to have to provide a reason for doing certain events, such as deleting an entry. And you can create a list of reasons for them to choose from. And if you have done that, then they will have to select a reason for performing that event. And I'll show you where you can do that here in a little bit. One of the other things to note with the starter edition of Audit Trail is that auditing is performed on all users. No users are exempt, regardless of any privileges or feature rights or access rights that they might have. So every user will be edited for everything that has been selected. Most of the actions performed in the repository can be logged, as you saw on the list here. Individual actions are grouped into event groups based on the event type. For instance, the session event group includes log on, log off, and terminate session events. Laserfiche Audit Trail determines which events will be logged by first checking who is logged into the repository. So once it knows who's logged into the repository, it will then check that user's audit settings for two possible types. The first is group membership. So if the user that is logged in is configured to inherit its audit settings by group membership, for example, and any of the groups to which the user belongs to have been configured to an audit event, then it will record that. The next is user configuration. So if events have been specifically assigned to the logged in user, only those events will be audited. If there are events that you would like to have all users audited for, you can actually enable auditing on the event for the Everyone group. The Everyone group is a special account. It's listed under the Users and Groups node that always includes all users of the system. So next I'll actually go into the repository. We'll look at where we can enable these at the repository level for the users and groups and how we're going to accomplish that. So I already have my Laserfiche administration console open. And you can see here that I've browsed to the Laserfiche directory accounts. I'm going to right click on my Forms Administrators group and go to Properties. And you can see here that I have an auditing tab available to me. So in this case, this group has the group membership selected. I can go to Audit Events. It will show me which ones are already enabled for this group. If you're wondering where these are coming from, it's actually coming from that Everyone group. So underneath Users and Groups, we have Everyone, and then we can right click on Everyone in the content pane and go to Properties. And it will pull the properties up there, and we can go to the Auditing tab here. So these are the events within the repository that are being audited for everyone, regardless of which group or what user they are. So if you want to change that, you can change that here. You can also edit reasons and things here, and I'll show you that here in just a moment. So let's go back to our Laserfiche directory accounts. I'm going to go back to our Forms Administrators and our Auditing tab. So if we wanted to change the types of events that are audited for this specific user group, we could change this to Selected Events, and then we can choose whether or not we want to record successful events or failure events for these types of events over here on the left. So you can pick and choose what it is that you want. And then down below where I was talking about with the advanced edition of Audit Trail, you are able to require users to give a reason when they do certain events. These are those events that I was referring to. So deleting, exporting, and printing. And the way that you configure this, by default, you can see there's no values in the reasons column, which means that it will not prompt the end user for a reason if they perform one of these actions. So if you want to require that, you can select one of these events here on the left, click Edit, and now you can add your reasons in here. Okay, so once we have the reasons in there, I can go ahead and click OK. You can now see that it populates there for me. And we can click Apply. And it now has those reasons saved for the repository for this group. And before I show you how that looks in the repository, I do want to make a note about this entry listing event here. The entry listing audit event will log every time a user browses a document, even if they do not open it. So for example, if a user opens a folder, this event will log every document that they can see in that folder. And if they perform a search, it will log every event in that search, even if they don't open any of the documents from the search results. So it's recommended to only use that option or audit that event if you really need it for some reason. Okay, so next let's take a look at how we do this in the web client. It looks a little bit different, but the concept is still the same. So I have the web client open here on my machine. I'm going to go up to my username and go to management. You do have to have management rights in order to perform these actions, similar to being able to be in the admin console. So from here, I'm going to go to groups, and we can see my forms administrator group is here. And when I select that on the right hand side, I have the auditing tab here, just like what I had in the admin console. So I can see all the same options. If I select delete entry, you can see the reasons that I actually saved in the admin console show up here as well. So next, let's see what this looks like when we try to delete an entry from the repository. So I will go back to my web client. You can see I have a couple documents here. I'm just going to select one of them, go to delete, and you can see that I am prompted for the reason for the deletion. So the user would simply come in here, select their reason. They can add additional comments if they want, and then click delete. Okay, next let's see how we actually configure Audit Trail within the Laserfiche repository. So I'm going to come back to our repository, and if we come down to auditing, we have settings. I'm just going to go into the properties. And so to begin with, we have our Laserfiche audit log path. This is actually set up during the installation of the Laserfiche repository that you create. That's the default path. It's usually the repository path or /audit, and then your log file. It will automatically set a rollover size. By default, it's 50 meg. You can change that if you want a larger size, but it is generally better to have smaller log files than larger ones. You can't set the maximum log file size larger than 200 megabytes, so just keep that in mind. If you're going to roll over based on time, it's a good idea to roll over frequently if your repository is a high volume. That way your log files don't get too large. So keep that in mind as well. But this is where you would set that up. Compressed rolled over log files, if you set that, it does not remove any of the data from the log files, so you don't have to worry about it deleting anything that you might need by selecting that option. If you choose both a maximum size and a maximum age, the log file will roll over when the first one is reached. If rolling over based on size, the size of the uncompressed log is the one that's considered if you have the automatically compressed rolled over audit log selected. To view the same thing in the Laserfiche web client, you have to have the Laserfiche web administration console installed. I don't have that currently, so I'm not going to walk through that, but it's essentially the same functionality. If you want to view your rollover logs on the left-hand side in the admin console, just select the rollover logs node, and you can see the information about your different audit logs that have been saved for the repository. I only have one. I don't use this repository that often, so I don't have a lot of data that's being recorded. You can right-click on a log and select Retrieve Rollover Logs. It will then ask where you want to save that log file to. So you could save it to your desktop, to a downloads folder, and then copy it over to your own computer, open it up, and you can view that log file if you would like to. Okay, and that's it for the repository. So now let's take a look at Laserfiche Audit Trail for Forms. And you can see here that I am on the Forms config page. On the left-hand side, I have an auditing node. I'm going to select that. And if I select Enable Audit Logging, we can see that it asks for our Laserfiche Audit Trail server. I recommend putting in your fully qualified domain name. You can see here that Use TLS Connection is enabled, so make sure that you are using that correctly. And down below here, we can see the different audit events within Laserfiche Forms that can be recorded. They're grouped similar to what you see in the repository. So if we expand accounts here, we can see the different items that would actually be recorded based on enabling the success or failure of an account event. These are the different actions that take place for that. With different versions of Laserfiche Forms and Audit Trail, they are enabling additional events to be recorded, so always look forward to that. The other thing that you should be aware of is that these are more like administrative type events. It's not someone editing the values on a form for an end user or anything like that. It's going to be on the back side where someone is manually editing like a variable value or something to that effect. And down on the bottom here, we have the Forms Audit Log folder. This is a temporary location. So this is where Forms will store its information temporarily, and then Audit Trail will actually pull that information into its folders on the server itself. So make sure that this location has enough room though to be able to hold the temporary logs until they get sent over to Audit Trail. Alright, so now that we know where we need to go inside of the repository and also Laserfiche Forms to configure auditing, let's actually configure the Laserfiche Audit Trail software itself. To do that, I'm going to go to my Start menu. We will scroll down here and you'll see Configure Laserfiche Audit Trail 11. So before we can begin running any audit reports, we have to configure this part of the software. This entails adding different repositories as well as forms to run reports on. So we need to provide it different information, how it's going to authenticate to the repository, for example. We need to specify the data that should be loaded and made available for audit reporting as well as who should actually be able to access Audit Trail. So when we first open the Audit Trail configuration page, we get a nice little welcome page. Since nothing has been configured yet, we don't see any of that information listed. So first, I'm going to go to the Repositories tab. And here we can set up a couple different things. So we can choose to add a repository or add a folder to pull the logs in from. So what's really the difference between the two here? So the first one, add repository, that will add an entire repository for it to import audit information about. So everything that is recorded, it will just automatically go out to the location of the Audit Trail log files. That'll pull that in and make it available for reporting. Adding a folder isn't used in the same way. The idea of adding a folder is if you have Audit Trail data or log files that have been rolled over and are no longer live or active within Audit Trail itself. Audit Trail is usually configured, and you'll see here in a little bit, to only keep X amount of days worth of data to be able to report on. Otherwise, I mean, over time, right, it would get so big it would be unmanageable. So the idea of being able to add a folder is to point it to a folder with specific log files in it and be able to load those log files. So maybe you needed to go back 3 years and you only have 1 year of audit data available within Audit Trail. You can go pull back that log file that may contain the information you need, load that into Audit Trail, so then you can perform searches on it. So that's the difference between add repository and add folder. There is also a repository setup wizard. So rather than walking through all this manually, we can walk through the repository setup wizard. It kind of guides you along. So that's what we're going to do in this video. So we will click repository setup wizard. You can see here that you can choose repository, folder, or repository and folder. We're just going to do repository today. So I will click next. And then the next thing is you have to select the repository. By default, it will go out and it will search to see if it can find repositories. You can see here that it found my fish bait repository, so I'm going to leave that as is. If it doesn't find it, you can manually enter the information, and you can also choose whether or not to use TLS connections when doing this. I'm going to go ahead and select Use TLS Connection. We will click Next. So this step of the repository configuration wizard is asking for how Audit Trail needs to authenticate to the repository that you selected. So the first option is Windows authentication. So if the Audit Trail importing service is actually running as a user that can authenticate into your repository, you could choose that option. You can see here when I bring up services, we have an importing service here. By default, it runs as the local system, so that obviously will not be able to log into the repository by default. So then we can come down here and select Laserfiche account, and we can add in a username and password. For this user account, I recommend setting up a separate account. Don't use your admin account. So we're going to go into the Laserfiche admin console. I'm going to create a new user. I'm just going to keep it simple. We're going to call it Audit Trail. We're going to allow this user to log in with a password. I'm going to ignore the maximum password age. The user can't change the password in this case. The user also does not need a license. It's basically a service account, so there's no reason for that. And then on the rights tab, the only thing that you need to set for the rights is going to be the ability for it to retrieve audit data. So we just have to check this box right here. We don't have to assign it to any groups or anything like that. That's all we need, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK. You'll also notice that I added this to the repository itself. I did not create this account in Directory Server. Technically, I could have added it to Directory Server and then brought it down into the repository. It's slightly faster. You're probably not going to notice that big of a difference though when it goes to authenticate. Because with it being a repository user, it authenticates directly to the repository and then comes back. If it's in Directory Server, it goes to the repository and then has to go out to Directory Server and back. So there's an extra hop there that has to happen. So usually with these service accounts, Forms is the same way. I usually like to create them directly in the repository itself, and every repository ends up with its own account, but again, it doesn't require a license in order to do this, so you're really not losing anything here. So let's go ahead and jump back over to the Audit Trail configuration. I can now put in my username and our password. Something else I see a lot too is a lot of people like to come up with fancy usernames. For example, Audit Trail. They like to do like LF Audit Trail or put Audit Trail all one word or anything like that. I don't see a need for that personally. I like to just make it simple. I do the same thing with a workflow account. People like shortening workflow for some reason. It makes it nicer within the system. You can easily read what it's for. Workflow and Forms, for example, when you're looking at who created or modified a document in the repository, it just simply says workflow. It doesn't have to be cryptic. I like making it easy for the end users. So now that I have that information in there, I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And the next part that we're going to do is the search engine settings. So there's a few things to be aware of in this configuration page. So your host is going to be where your Laserfiche full text search engine server is actually located at. So in Laserfiche Audit Trail version 11, Laserfiche did away with a SQL Server database. And it now uses the Laserfiche full text search engine server in order to do the cataloging and everything for Audit Trail. So again, the SQL database is gone. That was version 10. Version 11, we have LFFTS that we're using. LFFTS itself can actually be hosted on a separate server. For example, I've done implementations where we have a Laserfiche Forms server, Laserfiche Audit Trail, and a Laserfiche server with repositories all on different servers, and LFFTS on its own server as well. So in that case, we would come in here and we would put the host name of our LFFTS server. So in this case, it's all on the same machine, but I would recommend putting in your fully qualified domain name of the server in question. By default, you're going to use port 5053, and then you would need to select whether or not you're using TLS to connect to your LFFTS server. The other part here is the catalog folder. If you do have LFFTS on a separate server, this is the location of the catalog folder on the LFFTS server. So not on the Audit Trail server itself. So be aware of that as well. If you leave this the way that it is, if you had this local host, right, it would save it on this server that I'm on, which is server 01. If I change the host to a separate server and left this as it is, it would now go to that new server, and it's going to actually try saving these catalog files on the C drive of that new server. I would recommend creating or adding a separate drive for these different catalogs and doing it all that way. Like I said, as an example, I do have an implementation that I work with where LFFTS is on its own server. We actually have 3 different hard drives on that server. Each one has a different catalog folder that it uses for different repositories. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave it the way it is. We will click next. And then we get to select our date range. By default, Audit Trail selects the last 30 days. You can delete that. But first you have to go through and add a new time range. So if you wanted to do a year's worth of Audit Trail data, you can change the age. There's also the ability to do a range. I've done this before when I've been asked by usually a supervisor to pull a report that shows everything that someone did within a certain time frame. If that data is not currently active in my Audit Trail instance because it's past the date range that I have set up, I'll usually come in and I'll add a folder, for example, and I can pull everything of a certain age based on the date range. So by default though, I do recommend doing age. I'm just going to do a year. We will click OK, and now you can see I can delete the 30 days. I'll go ahead and click next. And on this page, we get to specify the users and groups that should be allowed to run reports on the audit data. And this is for the repository or forms. So you can see here the administrator is added by default. If we want to add permission, we can click this button. And we are searching the domain. So this does not connect to the Laserfiche repository. It also doesn't connect to LFTS to pull in those users and groups. So these are all Windows accounts that it's using to access this. So you can do a search, you could create an AD group, pull that group in and do it that way. And then you can select whether they are allowed or denied. I'm going to go ahead and click next. We can then review our configuration, verify everything looks correct, and then click finish. So it's now sending the new configuration to Audit Trail. Takes a moment, and now it's come back and you can see that we have our repository authentication. And now if I come up to Forms, you can see that my Forms does not have a configuration done. If I click Edit, I can then come in and enter in my default audit log folder. So this audit log folder is local to the Audit Trail server. So unlike where I was just talking about LFFTS, when you create the catalogs, this is actually creating the audit logs themselves for forms. With a repository, the logs are stored by default on the repository server. So this is a little bit different. So that's the location that you're entering in here. So I will come in, we will set up a folder, and I'm just going to call it Laserfiche Forms Audit Logs, and we'll click Save. And now if we go back to our forms config page, I did not enter in a server, so I'm going to do that now. We'll go ahead and copy it from there. We'll enter it in and then click Save. And once it's finished saving, I will then go back to the Configure Laserfiche Audit Trail page. And if we refresh this, we can see that we now have an audit source for forms. It will tell you some different information, the display name, form server, the database ID, and the audit log folder that contains it. It will also give you the folder size. So as that grows, you can see how large it is. You can add additional audit sources in here. So if you have multiple forms instances, all with their own databases, you can add them in here and it can take care of all of them at the same time. The same thing goes for the repositories. We can add additional repositories in here, and one instance of Audit Trail can take care of all that for you. When I do switch over to the repository tab, you can see the repository that we set up previously. We go to search catalogs, we have our different search information. So again, if we were using a different LFFTS server, which would be our search engine, it would give that name here, and then the catalog folder as it pertains to that LFFTS server. Down below, we can see how large our different catalogs are. So this is the catalog for the repository. It's 29.49 meg. If you've had Laserfiche for a while and this is your first time setting up Audit Trail, and you've had the audit license previously, it may take a while for that to catch up. So I've seen catalog sizes that are hundreds of gigabytes, depending on what age range you've set for your catalog. So just be aware of that. And then the last part, we have the permissions here, so we can see all that. Some of the other things that you can do with Audit Trail is you can actually open audit reports from within the repository. You do have to configure this in a couple places first, so let's talk about that. If we go to the admin console and we go to repository options, and we can go to settings. And inside of settings, we can go to the external URLs tab, and we can enter in our Laserfiche Audit Trail URL. So if I enter that in here, make sure you put the / audit trail on the end of it. And I will save that. And now if I go back and I open the Laserfiche Windows client, and once we log in, we can then come in and select an entry. It can be a folder or another type of entry like a document. We can go to tasks, and then we get this audit report option. If we click that, that will open our browser, automatically launch a report for Audit Trail. And what it's doing is it's passing the entry ID into the report for us. And so then it will pull back a report based on that entry specifically. And there we go. We can do the same thing in the web client. Again, there is a little bit of configuration that needs to happen. If we come into the web client 11 configuration page, and go to services, we need to enable the audit trail service here and enter in that URL. Once we've done that, when we are inside of the web client, we will be able to have the same option as what we had in the repository. So we can either right click on an entry and you see audit trail, or we can come up to more actions, advanced, and audit report from there. Another thing that you're able to do if you have Laserfiche Audit Trail licensing is you can create watermarks. I'm going to go to the Laserfiche admin console, and if I look at this group from the Laserfiche directory server, we can see that one of the tabs that I have here is a watermarks tab. So I can add any text in here that I would want displayed. And where this comes into play is when we decide to basically export or print an entry or a document from the Laserfiche repository, it will place this watermark on that document during the export or during the print. If you have more than one watermark, you can see here, right, I can add more than one. It's got an area for a list of watermarks that we can create. The end user will be able to select which one that will be applied. So you can look at this kind of like reasons. When you're deleting that we went over earlier, you could add the same type of thing with a watermark. They could select the reason of why they are exporting it, or maybe they just want certain text. Whatever your need is there, you would be able to add those different ones, and then when they go to export or print, if they're a member of this group, they would be able to select the watermark that they want applied to that entry. You are able to change the text size that is used for a watermark. In order to do that, we would be in the admin console. We're going to expand our repository options, and we can see the group watermark. So we're going to select that, right click and go to properties, and you can see the various options that we have for the watermark location. So we have the text size itself. We can select the position if we want it rotated, how see-through is that watermark, all those different options that you can customize that here. We also have the ability to add a header and footer to a group watermark. Headers appear directly above the primary watermark text, and the footer appears directly below the primary watermark text. The size for the header and footer text can be customized. However, the position and rotation of a header and footer is determined by the position and rotation configured for the watermark. So on that first tab that we had. So we can come through and enable this if we wanted to. You can see we can actually use tokens to populate certain values for our header and footer if we wanted to do that. And if that's not enough for you, we can also apply watermarks using tags. So if we go to our metadata management, tags, and we will create a new tag. And you can see that we have the ability to add the name, description, select whether it's a security tag, just like we always do. But now I have a watermark tab here as well. And so we can add watermark text, we can select the position, everything else like when we were doing the group watermark. we can add all of that in here. And if you ever needed to go in and change a watermark, you would simply just go back to that group or back to the tag, edit, look at the properties of that tag or group, and then you can change the settings within the same interface. And that is how we go through and configure Laserfiche Audit Trail to audit the Laserfiche repository as well as Laserfiche Forms. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, please ask them down below. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, keep fishing.